A millionaire used to luxury starts questioning his purpose. After an accident, he becomes paraplegic and disabled. A single mother agrees to take care of him for money. What she did in the following weeks left everyone shocked. Before listening to this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel sparkled with the glitter of expensive jewelry and rehearsed smiles. Richard Atwood, the real estate magnate, adjusted his Italian silk tie and forced another smile as he greeted the guests. At 45, he was the epitome of success. Perfectly trimmed salt and pepper hair, tailored suit, and a gold Rolex on his wrist. "Richard, darling," the shrill voice of his fiancée, Victoria, cut through the party's chatter. She approached, a red dress clinging to her slender body, champagne in hand. "You must meet the new ambassador. He's dying to discuss that project in Dubai." Richard nodded mechanically, allowing himself to be guided by his fiancée through the sea of familiar faces, all part of New York's high society. As they walked, he couldn't help but notice how the eyes of those present followed them, the perfect couple, the envy of all. However, something was different that night. Maybe it was the champagne, or maybe it was the weight of his 45 years making itself felt. But Richard began to see the scene with different eyes. The smiles seemed more plastic, the laughter more forced, the conversations emptier. "And then I told her, darling, that Birkin is so 2023, Victoria cackled, along with a group of socialites. Richard found himself observing the scene as if he were outside his own body. Was this it? Was this the life he had worked so hard for? An endless parade of social events, superficial business, and relationships based on interest? "Excuse me," he muttered, moving away from the group. Ignoring the confused looks, Richard walked to the hotel's balcony, the fresh night air of New York hitting his face like a slap of reality. Outside, the contrast couldn't be greater, while the party continued in its artificial splendor, real. Life pulsed in the streets below. Street vendors, carefree tourists, locals returning home after a long day of work. Richard found himself envying those simple people, with their seemingly purposeful lives. "Everything okay, love?" Victoria appeared at his side, a touch of irritation in her voice. "The ambassador is waiting." Richard turned to her, seeing her. As if for the first time. The perfect face, the result of countless small interventions, as she liked to call them. The green eyes, accentuated by colored contact lenses. The rehearsed smile, ready for any photographer who might appear. "Victoria," he began, feeling a lump in his throat. "Have you ever wondered if this is really what we want from life?" She blinked, confused. "What do you mean, Richard? We have everything anyone could want, money, status, everyone's respect. But what about happiness, purpose?" The words came out of his mouth before he could contain them. "Don't you feel like something's missing?" Victoria laughed, a melodious and empty sound. "Darling, I think you've had too much to drink. Let's get back to the party. There are important people waiting for you." But Richard didn't move. His eyes wandered to the horizon, where the city lights met the darkness of the ocean. Somewhere out there was the boy he used to be, full of dreams and ideals. What would that kid think of the man he had become? "I need some time," he said abruptly. "Time? What are you talking about?" Victoria was visibly irritated now. "We have the charity dinner next week and then the launch of the new development. There's no time for—" "No, Victoria," Richard interrupted her, his voice firm. "I need time for myself, to think, to find myself." He moved away from the balcony, leaving a dumbfounded Victoria behind. Crossing the hall, he ignored the calls and curious glances. For the first time in years, Richard didn't care what others thought. In the elevator, alone with his thoughts, he made a decision. He would visit his old childhood home in upstate New York, the place where he spent the summers of his youth, before ambition and the pursuit of success consumed him. As the elevator descended, Richard felt a mixture of fear and excitement. He was about to embark on a journey that could change everything. He'll search not only for his roots, but for a deeper meaning to his existence. In the hotel lobby, he ignored the valet offering the keys to his Porsche. Instead, he walked to the street and raised his hand for a passing taxi. "Where to, sir?" asked The driver, observing through the rearview mirror the elegantly dressed man getting into his car. Richard hesitated for a moment, then answered with a conviction he hadn't felt in years. "To the airport. I'm going home." The taxi plunged into New York's night traffic, taking Richard away from the life he knew. As the city lights passed in a blur, he couldn't help but think about what he was leaving behind and what he might find ahead. In his pocket, his cell phone vibrated incessantly. Messages from Victoria, missed calls from partners and friends. But for the first time in decades, Richard didn't care about responding. His heart beat, with an almost adolescent anxiety, mixed with a fear of the unknown that he hadn't felt in a long time. The familiar streets of New York gave way to the highway leading to the airport. Richard watched the landscape change, reflecting on how his life had transformed over the years, from a young man full of ideals to a man trapped in a golden cage of his own making. At the airport, he bought a ticket to Albany, from where he would take another flight to the interior. Sitting in the boarding lounge, Richard found himself surrounded by vacationing families, hurried executives and relaxed backpackers. Everyone seemed to have a purpose, a direction. He wondered when he had lost his. When the flight was announced, Richard stood up, leaving behind not just the city, but an entire life. As he walked to the boarding gate, he couldn't help but feel that he was taking the first step towards something bigger, something that could finally fill the void that had been consuming him for so long. The plane took off, carrying Richard to an uncertain destination. As the lights of New York faded behind him, he closed his eyes, allowing himself for the first time in years to dream of possibilities. What would he find in his old house? What memories awaited him? And more importantly, what version of himself would he rediscover? Little did Richard know that this trip would be just the beginning of a much deeper and more transformative journey than he could imagine. A journey that would take him not only back to his roots, but to a confrontation with his own being, his values, and the true meaning of success and happiness. As the plane cut through the night sky, Richard Atwood, the powerful real estate magnate, slept. And in his dreams, for the first time in a long time, he smiled, a genuine smile free from the shackles of social expectations and the weight of the empire he had built. Fate, however, had other plans for Richard, plans that would test his determination, challenge his convictions and force him to face long-buried truths. But for now, on that night in the sky, he was just a man in search of himself, flying towards an uncertain future, but full of possibilities. The sun had barely risen when Richard disembarked at the small Albany International Airport. The warm, humid air of upstate New York enveloped him like a familiar embrace, bringing back long-forgotten memories. He adjusted, his jacket, now wrinkled after the trip, feeling out of place among the few arriving passengers, most wearing simple clothes and carrying worn suitcases. "Taxi, sir?" A middle-aged man approached, smiling genuinely. Richard hesitated. His first reaction was to refuse, accustomed to luxury cars and private drivers, but something inside him made him nod. "Yes, please, to the Lake George region." The taxi driver, who introduced himself as Tony, raised his eyebrows. "Wow, that's quite a ways, huh? About 2 hours drive. You got family out there?" As he settled into the back seat of the old taxi, Richard felt a pang of nostalgia. "I used to. It's been a long time since I've been back." As they left the city behind, the landscape began to change. Buildings gave way to farms, asphalt to dirt roads. Richard observed everything with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. Each turn of the road seemed to bring back a piece of his childhood. "Excuse my curiosity," Tony spoke, looking through the rearview mirror, "but it's not every day I take someone so well-dressed to those parts. Coming back to visit family?" Richard hesitated. "Actually, I'm coming back to my old house, or what's left of it." The taxi driver nodded, understanding. "Ah, I see. Lots of people do that, you know. Come back to revisit their roots. Sometimes we need to look back to know where we're going, right?" The man's simple words hit Richard in an unexpected way. That was exactly what he was doing, wasn't it? Searching in the memories of the past for a meaning to his present. As they advanced along the winding road, Richard found himself sharing more than he intended. He talked about his childhood in the region, the summers spent at his grandfather's house playing in the creek that cut through the property. Those were simpler times, he reflected, more to himself than to Tony. And were they better? The taxi driver asked, his voice gentle. The question caught Richard by surprise. Were they better? He had achieved so much since then. Wealth, power, recognition, but happiness. Before he could answer, a strong thud shook the car. Tony cursed softly, maneuvering the vehicle to the shoulder. Flat tire, he announced after a quick inspection. Don't worry, sir. I've got a spare. Matter of minutes and we'll be back on the road. Richard got out of the car, feeling the sun's heat on his skin. While Tony changed the tire, he walked a few meters down the road, observing the landscape, the intense green of the mountains, the birdsong, the smell of wet earth, all so different from the concrete and glass he was used to. Suddenly a noise caught his attention. A group of children was passing by, laughing and chatting animatedly. They carried backpacks on their backs and had dirt on their feet. Probably returning from school, Richard thought. One of the girls, no more than 10 years old, stopped when she saw him. Her eyes widened at the sight of the man in a suit in the middle of the dirt road. Hi, mister, she said, curious. Are you lost? Richard couldn't help but smile. Actually, I think I'm finding myself. The girl frowned, confused, but was soon called by her friends and continued on her way, not without casting another curious glance at the strange visitor. Watching the children move away, Richard felt a pang in his chest. He remembered himself, at that age, running down these same roads carefree without the weight of the world on his shoulders. When had he lost that lightness? All set, sir. Tony's voice brought him back to the present. We can continue our journey. Back in the car, Richard noticed his hands were dirty with earth. Instead of cleaning them immediately as he normally would, he hesitated, observing the dirt on his fingers. It was as if that earth reconnected him with something long forgotten. As they approached Lake George, Richard's anxiety grew. What would he find? Would the house still be standing? And if it was, what would it mean to him now? It's right over there, Tony announced, pointing to a side road. The Atwood property. Right? Everyone around here knows it. Richard nodded, his throat suddenly dry. When the car finally stopped in front of an old wooden gate, he felt as if time had stopped. The house was there, a bit smaller than he remembered, the walls peeling, the roof in need of repairs. But it was there, a tangible piece of his past. Want. Am I to wait, sir? Tony asked, noticing Richard's hesitation. No, thank you, Richard replied, his voice almost a whisper. I think I'll stay here for a while. He paid for the ride, giving Tony a generous tip. Tony thanked him, wishing him good luck before departing. Alone in front of the gate, Richard felt the weight of his decisions. Not just the decision to come here, but all the choices that had led him to become the man he was today. With a deep sigh, he pushed the gate, which creaked in protest. Each step towards the house seemed laden with meaning. Memories flooded him. The smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the sound of the creek at the back of the property, the laughter of family gathered on the porch. Upon reaching the front door, Richard hesitated. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. It was as if by opening that door, he was opening not just an abandoned house, but a forgotten part of himself. The creak of the door echoed through the empty house. Richard took a step inside, dust dancing in the light that entered through the dirty windows. Covered furniture, pictures on the walls, everything exactly as he had left it years ago. Walking slowly through the living room, his fingers brushed an old piano. The keys, yellowed by time, emitted out-of-tune notes at his touch. For a moment, Richard saw himself as a child again, practicing scales under his grandmother's watchful eye. On the wall, a family portrait caught his attention. He approached, cleaning the dust from the glass. There he was, a smiling 10-year-old boy next to his parents and grandparents. Everyone looked so happy, so full of hope for the future. What happened to us? Richard murmured to himself, feeling a lump in his throat. He continued his exploration of the house, each room bringing forth an avalanche of emotions and memories. In what used to be his room, he found old toys, school books, a deflated soccer ball, fragments of a life that seemed to belong to someone else. Upon reaching the kitchen, Richard stopped, stunned by the familiarity. He could almost smell his grandmother's cornbread, hear the lively conversations during breakfast. When was the last time he had a truly meaningful meal, surrounded by people he loved? Exiting through the back of the house, Richard found himself in front of the old creek. The sound of running water instantly calmed him. He walked to the bank, observing the dancing reflections on the surface. It was then that something unexpected happened. As he leaned to touch the water, Richard lost his balance. In the blink of an eye, he was falling, rolling down the steep bank that led to the creek. Everything happened very quickly. The fall, the impact against the rocks, the cold water enveloping his body. When he finally managed to sit up, soaked and dazed, Richard realized he couldn't feel his legs. Panic overwhelmed him. He tried to move, to shout for help, but his voice came out weak, muffled by the sound of the water. The realization hit him like a punch. He was alone, injured, in an isolated place where no one knew he was. As pain and fear enveloped him, Richard couldn't help but think of the irony of the situation. He had come in search of a new beginning, of answers for his life. Now, struggling to stay conscious, he wondered if this new beginning would be very different from what he had imagined. The waters of the creek continued to flow, indifferent to the drama unfolding. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the property. And there, trapped between the rocks and the current, Richard Atwood faced the most crucial moment of his life, not knowing if there would be a tomorrow to tell his story. Night was falling quickly over the Atwood property. The sky, previously a mosaic of sunset colors, was now tinged with a deep blue, punctuated by stars that were beginning to appear. In the creek, Richard struggled against exhaustion and the cold that was seeping into his bones. "Help!" he shouted once more, his voice hoarse from calling. But only the sound of running water and the occasional hoot of an owl responded. The hours dragged on. Richard, soaked and shivering, tried to stay conscious. His thoughts wandered between the despair of the present moment and reflections on his life. How ironic that he, Richard Atwood, the powerful businessman who controlled financial empires with a phone call, was now completely powerless, at the mercy of nature and chance. It was then, in the midst of darkness, that a beam of light cut through the night. "Is anyone there?" A female voice echoed across the property. Richard felt a wave of relief and hope. "Here, in the creek, I need help." Hurried footsteps approached, and soon a figure appeared on the bank of the creek. It was a woman, around 30 years old, dark, hair tied in a ponytail, wearing jeans and a plaid shirt. "Oh my God," she exclaimed, pointing the flashlight at Richard. "What happened? Are you all right?" "I fell," Richard replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I can't feel my legs." The woman acted quickly. Carefully, she made her way down to the creek, assessing the situation. "My name is Claire," she introduced herself, her voice calm but firm. "I'm a nurse. I'm going to help you, but I need you to stay as still as possible, okay?" Richard nodded, grateful for Claire's competent presence. She took out her cell phone from her pocket and made a quick call. "John? It's Claire. I need urgent help at the old Atwood property. Yes, now, bring Sebastian too and ropes." While they waited, Claire asked Richard questions, keeping him conscious and assessing his injuries. "You're lucky," she commented. "I just happened to pass by here. I live on the neighboring farm and sometimes take night walks." Richard tried to muster a smile. "I guess lucky isn't quite the word I'd use to describe my current situation." Claire looked at him with a mixture of compassion and curiosity. "What brings you here, if you don't mind me asking?" "This house has been abandoned for years." Before Richard could answer, voices and lights approached. Two men appeared on the bank of the creek, carrying ropes and an improvised stretcher. Carefully and under Claire's precise instructions, they managed to get Richard out of the water and onto solid ground. The process was painful, and Richard bit his lips to keep from screaming. "We need to take him to the hospital in Albany," Claire declared after a quick assessment. "John, can you drive?" The older man nodded, and soon they were all in an old pickup truck, bouncing along the dirt. Rode towards the city. Richard, lying in the back of the vehicle with Claire by his side, monitoring his vital signs, felt a wave of gratitude for these strangers who were helping him without asking questions. The trip to the hospital seemed endless. Every bump in the road sent waves of pain through Richard's body, but he struggled to maintain his composure. Claire, noticing his discomfort, held his hand. "It's going to be okay," she assured him. "We're almost there." At the Albany Medical Center, the medical team acted quickly. Richard was taken for exams, and soon the diagnosis was confirmed: a spinal injury that temporarily compromised the movement of his legs. "You'll have to stay hospitalized for a few days," the doctor explained. "The good news is that there doesn't seem to be permanent damage, but recovery will take time and require intensive physiotherapy." As he was settled into a private room, Richard found himself confronted with a new reality. He, who had always been in control, now depended completely on others for the most basic tasks. Claire, who had accompanied the whole process, appeared at the door of the room. "I just wanted to see how you were doing before I left," she said, smiling gently. Richard looked at her, feeling a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability that he wasn't used to. "I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life." Claire made a dismissive gesture with her hand. "No need to thank me. Anyone would have done the same." But Richard knew it wasn't true. In his world, people rarely did anything without expecting something in return. "Can I at least know your full name?" he asked, "so I can repay you somehow when I get out of here." Claire hesitated for a moment, then answered, "Claire Thompson, but really no kind of repayment is necessary, Mr. Atwood." "Richard Atwood," he introduced himself, noticing a flash of recognition in her eyes. "Well, Mr. Atwood, rest now," Claire said, her voice soft. "Tomorrow will be a new day." As she left, Richard found himself alone with his thoughts. The hospital room, although comfortable, was a cruel reminder of how his life had changed in a matter of hours. His cell phone, recovered from his soaked belongings, wouldn't stop vibrating with messages and missed calls from Victoria, partners and assistants. Ignoring the notifications, Richard closed his eyes, exhausted. The last 24 hours passed through his mind like a movie. The party at the Plaza Hotel, the impulsive decision to return home, the accident in the creek. How had a simple search for meaning resulted in such a drastic change in his life? As sleep enveloped him, Richard couldn't help but think of Claire and the disinterested kindness she had shown. It was a stark contrast to the world he was used to, where every action had a price, every favor demanded a counterpart. In the days that followed, Richard faced not only the physical challenges of his condition, but also a profound re-evaluation of his life and values. The visits from doctors and nurses, the painful physiotherapy sessions, everything seemed a test of his determination and patience. Victoria finally managed to speak to him on the phone, her voice a mixture of concern and irritation. "Richard, for God's sake, where did you go? We have the launch of the new development in 2 weeks." Richard sighed, feeling a weariness that went beyond the physical. "Victoria, I had an accident. I'm in the hospital in Albany." The silence on the other end of the line was momentary. "Oh my God, are you okay? Do you want me to come there? I can take the company jet and—" "No," Richard interrupted her, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "It's not necessary. I'll be fine." After hanging up, Richard sat observing the window, watching the movement of the city outside. Hurried people, ambulances coming and going, life following its normal course while his was on pause. It was in this moment of reflection that a soft knock on the door brought him back to the present. To his surprise, it was Claire. "Sorry to bother you," she said, entering the room timidly. "I was on duty and thought I'd see how you were doing." Richard felt an involuntary smile form on his lips. "Please come in, and you can call me Richard." Claire approached, her eyes examining the monitors and Richard's countenance with a professional look. "How are you feeling? Physically or emotionally?" Richard asked, half joking, half serious. Claire smiled, understanding. "Both, I suppose." For some reason he couldn't explain, Richard found himself opening up to this near stranger. He talked about his life in New York, about the feeling of emptiness that led him back to his childhood home that fateful night, about the accident, and the reflections that had arisen since then. Claire listened attentively without judging. When Richard finished, she remained silent for a moment before speaking. "You know, Richard, sometimes life forces us to stop so that we can really see what's important," she said softly. "Maybe this is your moment of rediscovery." Claire's words resonated deeply with Richard. He observed her, noticing for the first time the details, the tired but kind eyes, the calloused hands of someone who worked hard, the posture of someone who carried responsibilities greater than they appeared. "And you, Claire?" he found himself asking. "What's your story?" A sad smile passed over her lips. "Ah, it's a long story. Maybe for another day. Now you need to rest." As Claire prepared to leave, Richard felt a sudden urgency not to let her go. "Could you come back tomorrow?" he asked, feeling strangely vulnerable. "If it's not an inconvenience, of course." Claire stopped at the door, looking at him with an expression Richard couldn't decipher. "Sure," she finally answered. "See you tomorrow, Richard." When the door closed, Richard found himself in a state of mind he hadn't experienced in years. Despite the pain, the uncertainty about his future, there was a small flame of what? Hope, curiosity. He wasn't sure. What he did know was that, for the first time in a long time, he was looking forward to the next day. Not for business, not for power or status, but for the simple possibility of a genuine conversation with someone who seemed to see beyond the facade of Richard Atwood, the magnate. As night fell over Albany, Richard fell asleep with a comforting thought. Maybe, just maybe, this accident wasn't the end of something, but the beginning of a much more meaningful journey than he could imagine. The days in the hospital dragged on, each bringing its own load of challenges and discoveries for Richard. The physiotherapy sessions were exhausting, testing not only his physical limits but also his determination. He, who had always been a man of action, now found himself forced into a patience he never knew he possessed. Claire's visits became a bright spot in his new routine. She appeared almost every day, sometimes just for a few minutes between her shifts, other times staying for hours, talking about everything and nothing. "How was physiotherapy today?" Claire asked during one of these visits, sitting in the chair next to Richard's bed. He sighed, running a hand through his now disheveled hair. "Difficult, frustrating. I feel like I'm learning to walk again." Claire smiled understandingly. "In a way you are. But each small progress is a victory, Richard. Don't forget that." There was something in the way she spoke, a mixture of firmness and gentleness that made Richard want to try harder. It was a strange feeling for someone used to giving orders, not receiving them. "Claire," he began, hesitant, "you never told me your story. How did you end up here in Albany?" She remained silent for a moment, her eyes fixed on the window of the room. "It's a long story, actually. I don't even know where to start." "From the beginning," Richard suggested, a smile playing on his lips. Claire laughed softly. "Fair enough. Well, I was born and raised right here, on a farm not far from your old property. My parents were farm workers, simple people, but full of dreams for their children." She paused, as if reliving memories. "I always wanted to be a nurse, you know, since I was little. I studied hard, got a scholarship to college in New York City. Those were tough years, working and studying, but I managed to graduate." Richard listened attentively, fascinated. It was a world so different from his, full of struggles he had never had to face. "And after graduation?" he asked, genuinely interested. "Ah, that's when things got complicated," Claire continued, a touch of sadness in her voice. "My father got sick. Cancer. I came back home to take care of him and the farm. It was a difficult time." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "I'm sorry." Claire nodded, silently thanking him. "After he passed, I thought about going back to the big city, but I realized that this is where I was most needed. There are so many people around here who need medical care and don't have easy access. So you stayed, Richard concluded, a new admiration in his voice. Yes, I stayed. I work at the hospital, do home visits when I can. It's not a glamorous life, but she smiled, looking directly at Richard. It's a life with purpose. The words hit Richard like lightning. Purpose. That was exactly what he had been seeking, wasn't it? What had led him back to his childhood home on that fateful night. You're an incredible woman, Claire, he said softly, surprised by the sincerity in his own voice. She blushed slightly, averting her gaze. I just do what I believe. Is right, Richard. Nothing more than that. The silence that followed was comfortable, full of unspoken reflections. It was Claire who finally broke it. And you, Richard, what do you plan to do when you get out of here? The question caught him by surprise. He hadn't thought much beyond his immediate recovery. I don't know, he admitted. My life in New York seems so distant now, so empty. Claire observed him attentively. Maybe it's time to fill it with something new. Before Richard could respond, Claire's cell phone rang. She answered it quickly, her expression changing to concern. I need to go, she said, standing up. Emergency at the hospital. We'll talk more later, okay? Richard nodded, watching her leave hurriedly. He sat there alone with his thoughts, Claire's words echoing in his mind. In the days that followed, Richard found himself increasingly immersed in reflections about his life and his choices. The calls from Victoria and his partners in New York became less frequent, and he found himself not missing them. One afternoon, during a particularly difficult physiotherapy session, Richard had an epiphany. As he struggled to take a few steps supported by parallel bars, sweating and trembling with the effort, he realized he was feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Genuine accomplishment. Very good, Mr. Atwood, the physiotherapist encouraged him. You're making incredible progress. At that moment, Richard understood what Claire meant about every small victory. Those few painful steps meant more to him than any million-dollar deal he had ever closed. Back in his room, exhausted but satisfied, Richard was surprised by an unexpected visit. Victoria was standing at the door, impeccably dressed and made up, looking out of place in the simple hospital environment. Richard, darling, she exclaimed, entering the room, I finally managed to come see you. How are you? He observed her, noticing how she seemed artificial. Every gesture, every expression, everything seemed rehearsed. I'm getting better, Victoria, he replied simply. What brings you here? She sat down, crossing her legs elegantly. Well, I came to see you, of course. And also, well, we need to discuss the future, don't we? The business, the development launch. Richard gently interrupted her. Victoria, I almost died. I've spent the last few weeks reevaluating a lot in my life. The business, it's not my priority. Anymore. The shock on her face was evident. What do you mean, Richard? You built an empire. You can't just abandon everything. I'm not talking about abandoning, he explained patiently, but about changing, about doing something with more purpose. Victoria looked at him as if he had grown a second head. Purpose? Richard, darling, did you hit your head in this accident? We have everything anyone could want. It was at this moment that Claire entered the room, stopping abruptly when she saw Victoria. Oh, sorry, I didn't know you had a visitor. I'll come back later. No, Richard said, perhaps too quickly. Please stay. Claire, this is Victoria, my fiancée. The last word came out with difficulty. Victoria, this is Claire. She saved my life. The two women sized each other up for a moment, the contrast between them stark. Victoria, with her designer dress and expensive jewelry, and Claire in her simple nurse's uniform. Enchanted, Victoria said, her tone making it clear she was far from enchanted. Richard, we need to talk in private. But Richard had already made his decision. Looking from Victoria to Claire, he clearly saw the path he wanted to follow. There's nothing to discuss in private, Victoria, he said firmly. My life has changed. I've changed. And I think it's time we go our separate ways. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria looked at Richard, then at Claire, and back at Richard. Without saying a word, she picked up her purse and left. The room, the sound of her heels echoing down the hallway. Claire, still standing at the door, looked at Richard with a mixture of surprise and concern. "Are you sure about this, Richard?" He smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Absolutely. It's time for a new beginning." As the sun set outside, casting a golden glow through the hospital room window, Richard found himself on the threshold of a new life. A life that, he hoped, would be full of purpose, meaning, and, who knows, true love. The path ahead would be challenging, he knew. Fully recovering, redefining his career, rebuilding his life on more solid foundations. But for the first time in a long time, Richard Atwood was looking forward to the future, ready to face each new day with courage and determination. And as he watched Claire check his vital signs, smiling gently at him, Richard was certain that no matter what the future held, he wouldn't be alone on this journey. The weeks passed, and with them, Richard saw his life transform in ways he never imagined. His discharge from the hospital came with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He was improving, yes, but he still had a long way to go. "Remember, Mr. Atwood," the doctor said on the day of his discharge, "recovery is a process. It will require patience and dedication." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of these words. Patience had never been his strong suit, but now he was determined to learn. The question of where to stay after discharge was resolved in an unexpected way. Claire, upon learning that Richard planned to stay at a hotel in the city, made a surprising offer. "Why don't you stay at the guest house on my farm?" she suggested. "It's quiet, there's space for your physiotherapy sessions and, well, I could keep an eye on you." The offer caught Richard by surprise. "Are you sure, Claire? I don't want to be a bother." She smiled, that smile he was beginning to adore. "No bother at all. Besides, I think some country air will be good for your recovery." And so, Richard found himself trading the luxury he was accustomed to for the simplicity of a farmhouse. Claire's property was modest but welcoming. The main house, an old but well-maintained building, was just a few meters from the guest house where Richard settled. The first days were quite an adjustment. Accustomed to the frantic pace of the big city, Richard now found himself waking to the crowing of roosters and the distant mooing of cattle. The nights were almost deafeningly quiet, punctuated only by the chirping of crickets and the occasional barking of a dog in the distance. Claire proved to be an attentive but firm hostess. She established a rigorous routine for Richard's recovery. Physiotherapy in the morning, short walks in the afternoon, and plenty of rest between activities. "You need to learn to listen to your body," she often said, when she saw him pushing himself too hard. One morning during breakfast, Richard finally mustered the courage to approach a subject that had been on his mind. "Claire," he began, hesitant, "I've been thinking, I want to do something good with my money, you know? Something that really makes a difference around here." She looked at him over her coffee cup, curious. "What kind of thing do you have in mind?" Richard took a deep breath. "Well, you mentioned that many people in the region have difficulty accessing medical care. What if I funded a clinic? Something to serve the local community?" Claire's eyes widened. "Richard, that would be amazing. But it's a huge project. Are you sure?" He smiled, feeling an excitement he hadn't experienced in years. "Absolutely. I think I've found my purpose, Claire. I want to use my resources to make a difference in people's lives, and I want to start here." The smile Claire gave him at that moment made his heart race in a way that no million-dollar deal ever had. In the days that followed, Richard immersed himself in planning the clinic. He made calls, consulted experts, and began to sketch out the first outlines of the project. Claire, with her knowledge of local needs, became an invaluable partner, but not everything was rosy. One afternoon, while they were working together on the porch of the main house, Richard received a call that left him visibly shaken. "What happened?" Claire asked, concerned, when he hung up the phone with a grim expression. Richard sighed heavily. "It was my lawyer in New York. It seems that some of my partners are not very happy with my change of priorities. They're threatening to sue me, claiming I'm neglecting the business." Claire put a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Oh, Richard, I'm sorry. What are you going to do?" He looked at her, a fierce determination in his eyes. I'm going to fight. I won't let them stop me from doing what's right. This clinic project, it's too important to give up. That night, sitting on the porch of the guest house, Richard reflected on how his life had changed in such a short time. Just a few months ago, his biggest concern was closing the next big deal or attending the social event of the season. Now, here he was, on a farm in upstate New York, planning a community clinic and facing the possibility of losing everything he had built. But strangely, he didn't feel afraid. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt he was on the right path, and he had the growing feeling that as long as he had Claire by his side, he could face any challenge. As if conjured by his thoughts, Claire appeared on the porch, bringing 2 cups of tea. "I thought you might want some company," she said softly, sitting down next to him. Richard gratefully accepted the cup, feeling the comforting warmth in his hands. "Thank you, Claire. Not just for the tea, but for everything." She smiled, that smile that lit up her eyes. "No need to thank me. We're in this together, remember?" They sat there side by side, watching the stars that dotted the night sky. The silence between them was comfortable, full of unspoken promises and possibilities. Richard knew that the days ahead would be challenging. There would be obstacles to overcome, battles to be fought. But there, in that moment, with Claire by his side and a clear purpose in his heart, he felt stronger than ever. The man who once measured success in figures and contracts now saw wealth in the simplicity of a shared moment, in the promise of making a difference in the lives of others. And as the gentle upstate New York breeze played with his hair, Richard Atwood knew, with a certainty that came from the depths of his soul, that he was exactly where he should be. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in his life, Richard was eager to face the unknown. With Claire as his moral compass and the clinic project as his North Star, he was ready to write the next chapter of his life, a chapter of redemption, purpose, and, who knows, true love. Night was falling gently, bringing with it the promise of a new day, and with it, new opportunities to sow change, cultivate hope, and reap a better future for all. Richard and Claire were ready for this new chapter, eager to see what other wonders fate had in store for them. The months that followed brought a mix of challenges and triumphs for Richard. The community clinic project was advancing, albeit not without obstacles. Each step forward seemed to come with 2 new complications. One morning, Richard was on the porch of the guest house, immersed in a pile of documents, when Claire arrived with breakfast. "Did you sleep out here?" she asked, noticing the dark circles under his eyes. Richard rubbed his face, tired. "I think so. I've been reviewing these contracts all night. The City Hall bureaucrats are making it difficult to release the land for the clinic." Claire put the tray on the table and sat down next to him. "Richard, you need to rest. You can't help anyone if you fall ill from exhaustion." He smiled weakly. I know, it's just that the longer it takes, the more people go without adequate medical care." "And that's why I admire you so much," Claire said softly, placing her hand over his. "But remember, this is a marathon, not a 100-meter dash." Her touch sent an electric current through Richard's body. Over the past few months, they had grown closer and closer, but always maintaining a fine line between friendship and something more. Before Richard could respond, his cell phone rang. It was his lawyer in New York. "Richard," the voice on the other end sounded grave, "we have a problem. Your ex-partners have filed a lawsuit to freeze your assets. They claim you're using company resources for personal projects without authorization." The world seemed to spin around Richard. "But that's absurd. I'm using my own money for the clinic." "I know, but they're playing dirty. They're going to try to delay as much as possible, hoping you'll give up on the project." After hanging up, Richard faced Claire, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "They want to freeze my assets. If they succeed, the clinic project." "Everything will be all right," Claire interrupted him, her voice firm. "We're going to fight this, together." In the weeks that followed, Richard found himself in a battle on 2 fronts, fighting local bureaucracy to advance the clinic and defending himself against the accusations of his ex-partners in New York. The stress began to take its toll. Richard felt constant pain in his legs, a reminder that his recovery was still not complete, but he refused to give up. One afternoon, While walking around the property with Claire, discussing strategies for the clinic, a heavy rain caught them by surprise. Running to take shelter in a nearby barn, the two found themselves soaked and breathless. "Well," Claire laughed, wringing out her wet hair, "I guess nature decided we needed a break." Richard couldn't help but laugh too, feeling some of the tension from the past few days dissipate. "You know, Claire, sometimes I wonder if I'm not being crazy. I left everything in New York. I'm risking my fortune. And for what?" Claire looked at him intensely. "To make a difference, Richard. To be the person you always wanted to be but never had the courage." At that moment, with the rain falling outside and the smell of wet earth in the air, something changed between them. Richard found himself lost in Claire's eyes, seeing in them not just understanding, but something deeper. "Claire, he began, but was interrupted by the sound of his cell phone. It was the mayor of the town. Apparently, after months of negotiation, they had finally gotten approval for the clinic's land. The news was like a ray of sunshine after the storm. Richard and Claire hugged, celebrating the victory. But when they pulled apart, the air between them was charged with a different kind of electricity. "Richard," Claire said softly, "I think we need to talk about us." He nodded, feeling his heart race. "Yes, I think we do." But before they could continue, they heard shouts coming from the direction of the main house. It was one of the farm workers, running towards the barn. "Miss Claire, the creek has overflowed. The water is getting close to the houses." Reality hit them like a bucket of cold water. The conversation would have to wait. There was an emergency to deal with. The following hours were a whirlwind of activity. Richard, Claire, and the farm workers fought against the flood, placing sandbags, helping to evacuate the houses closest to the creek, and ensuring everyone was safe. It was during this chaos that Richard saw Claire in her true essence. She led, organized, consuled, and worked tirelessly, always putting the needs of others before her own. When the situation was finally under control, it was already dawn. Soaked, exhausted, but relieved, Richard and Claire found themselves again on the porch of the main house. "Are you okay?" Richard asked, noticing the tiredness in her eyes. Claire nodded, a small smile on her lips. "I am. And you?" "Never been better," he replied, surprising himself with the truth of that statement. They stood there side by side, watching the sunrise that was beginning to paint the sky. The storm had passed, literally and figuratively. "Claire," Richard began, turning to her, "about that conversation we started in the barn." She looked at him expectant. "Yes?" "I think. No, I'm sure. I'm in love with you." The words hung between them, full of promise and possibility. Claire smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I am too, Richard. I'm in love with you too." When their lips finally met, it was as if all the pieces of a puzzle had finally fallen into place. There, with the sun rising on the horizon, Richard knew he had found not just a new purpose, but also a new home. The path ahead would still be full of challenges. The legal battle with his ex-partners, the construction of the clinic, the ups and downs of a new relationship. But with Claire by his side, Richard felt ready to face any storm that might come. As the new day dawned, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings, Richard embraced Claire, grateful for every decision, every challenge that had brought him here. The man who once measured success in numbers now measured it in smiles, in lives touched, and in the love found in the arms of an extraordinary woman. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in his life, Richard Atwood was eager to discover what it held. The following months brought a mixture of joy and challenges for Richard and Claire. Their relationship blossomed, bringing a new light to both their lives. At the same time, the community clinic project advanced, though not without obstacles. One sunny morning, Richard woke up early, anxious for the day ahead. It was the day of the groundbreaking ceremony for the clinic. After months of planning, negotiations, and overcoming bureaucratic barriers, they would finally see the concrete beginning of the project. "Nervous?" Claire asked, entering the room, with 2 cups of coffee. Richard smiled, accepting the cup. "A little. It's strange, you know. I've launched much bigger ventures than this, but I've never felt so emotional. Claire sat next to him on the bed, her eyes shining with pride. That's because this time it's different, Richard. It's not just a business, it's a dream, our dream. He kissed her softly, marveling at how his life had changed. You're right, as always. The ceremony was a simple but significant event. Residents of the region, local authorities, and even some reporters from regional newspapers attended. Richard, wearing jeans and a dress shirt, a look quite different from the expensive suits he used to wear in New York, gave an emotional speech. This clinic, he said, his voice laden with emotion, is not just a building. It's a promise. A promise of care, attention, dignity for every person in this community. It's the beginning of a new era of health and well-being for all of us. By his side, Claire smiled, her eyes misty. When it came time to symbolically throw the first shovelful of earth, they did it together, their hands united on the tool. The day seemed perfect, a celebration of everything they had achieved. But fate had other plans. While talking with guests, after the ceremony, Richard noticed a man in a suit approaching, an envelope in hand. His heart sank as he recognized the serious expression of the newcomer. "Mr. Atwood," the man called out, "I have a summons for you." The cheerful buzz around them seemed to disappear. Richard took the envelope with trembling hands, aware of the curious glances from those present. "What is this?" Claire asked softly, concern evident in her voice. Richard opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the document. His face paled. "My ex-partners, they've done it. A judge in New York has frozen all my assets until the lawsuit is resolved." The impact of the news was like a punch to the stomach. All the work, all the plans for the clinic, everything seemed to be crumbling in an instant. "But what about the clinic?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "I don't know, Claire, I simply don't know." The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings with lawyers, desperate phone calls, and sleepless nights. The clinic project was on hold, suppliers and builders demanding guarantees that Richard couldn't give. One night, sitting on Claire's house porch, Richard allowed himself, for the first time, to consider the possibility of giving up. Maybe I should go back to New York," he said softly, avoiding Claire's gaze. "Sort out this mess, try to save what I can of my business." Claire looked at him, a mixture of sadness and determination in her eyes. "Is that really what you want, Richard? To go back to that life?" He sighed deeply. "No, it's not what I want. But what else can I do? Without money, how are we going to build the clinic? How am I going to help people here?" It was then that Claire did something that surprised Richard. She stood up, went to a cabinet, and came back with a small wooden box. "Remember when I told you about my father?" she asked, opening the box. "About how he got sick and I had to come back to take care of him?" Richard nodded, not understanding where she was going with this. "What I didn't tell you," Claire continued, "is that before he passed, he gave me this." She took an old pocket watch out of the box. "It was my grandfather's," she explained. "Passed down from generation to generation. My father told me to use it only in case of extreme necessity." Richard looked at the watch, beginning to understand. "Claire, no, you can't sell this. It's a family heirloom." She smiled, tears in her eyes. "Richard, you don't understand. This clinic, what we're doing here, this is more important than any object. My father would be proud to know that his watch helped save lives." Richard felt his heart fill with an emotion he could barely contain. He pulled Claire into a tight embrace, letting his own tears fall. "You're amazing, you know that," he whispered. She pulled back a little, looking into his eyes. "We're amazing, Richard, and we're going to get through this together." At that moment, something changed inside Richard. The hopelessness that threatened to consume him was replaced by a fierce determination. They would find a way. No matter what his ex-partners in New York did, no matter how many obstacles arose, they would fight. "You're right," he said, a new energy in his voice. "We're not giving up. We're going to fight for this clinic, for these people, for our dream." In the days that followed, Richard and Claire dedicated themselves to finding creative solutions to their problems. They organized fundraising events in the community, sought partnerships with local companies, and even started an online crowdfunding campaign. The news of Richard's asset freeze, which initially seemed like a fatal blow, ended up having an unexpected effect. The story of the ex-magnate who gave up everything to build a clinic in the countryside made headlines, attracting attention and support from across the country. Slowly but steadily, things began to change. Donations started to come in. Volunteers offered to help with the construction. Doctors from other regions offered to come work at the clinic when it was ready. One afternoon, while supervising the restart of the clinic's construction, now largely funded by the community and donors, Claire turned to Richard. "You know," she said, a smile playing on her lips, "I think we should thank your ex-partners." Richard looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "Think about it," she explained. "If they hadn't frozen your assets, you would have built this clinic alone. Now look around you. It's the whole community building together. It's much more powerful this way, don't you think?" Richard looked at the construction site, seeing volunteers working side by side with professionals, all united by a common goal. He smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. "You're right, as always," he said, pulling her close. "This is bigger than both of us now. It's a dream of an entire community." As the sun set on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the skeleton of the future clinic, Richard and Claire stood there, hand in hand, watching the fruit of their work and love take shape. The road ahead would still be long and full of challenges. The legal battle in New York was far from over, and there was still much work to be done. But at that moment, seeing the determination in the eyes of the people around them, feeling Claire's unwavering support by his side, Richard knew with a certainty that came from the depths of his soul that they had made the right choice. The man who once measured success in figures now measured it in smiles, in transformed lives, and in the unconditional love he had found in the arms of an extraordinary woman. And for the first time in his life, Richard Atwood felt truly rich. Autumn arrived in upstate New York, painting the landscape with shades of gold and red. The construction of the clinic was progressing rapidly, driven by the joint effort of the community. Richard, who once commanded million-dollar ventures from a luxurious office, now often found himself with hands dirty from soil, working side by side with volunteers and local workers. One afternoon, while supervising the installation of newly arrived medical equipment, Richard received an unexpected call. It was his former assistant in New York, Mark. Richard, Mark's voice sounded hesitant. "Sorry to bother you, but I thought you should know. There are rumors circulating here in New York. Your ex-partners, and they're planning something big." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. "What kind of thing, Mark?" "I'm not sure of the details, but I heard they intend to use your prolonged absence as an argument for a hostile takeover of the company. They're painting you as an absent and irresponsible CEO." After hanging up, Richard stood still, absorbing the information. The entire empire he had built over the years was about to crumble. Part of him wanted to run back to New York, fight tooth and nail for what was rightfully his. But another part, the part that had grown and changed in recent months, wondered if that really mattered now. "Is everything okay?" Claire's voice brought him back to reality. She approached, concern evident in her eyes. Richard hesitated for a moment before sharing the news. Claire listened attentively, her face a mixture of concern and determination. "What are you going to do?" she asked softly. Richard looked around at the clinic under construction, at the faces of volunteers working tirelessly. "I don't know. Part of me wants to go back and fight, but another part wants to stay and finish what we started here," Claire completed, understanding perfectly. He nodded, grateful that she understood his dilemma. "It's more than that, Claire. Here, doing this, I feel complete, fulfilled in a way I never felt before, not even with all the millions I earned." Claire smiled, taking his hand. "Then I think you already have your answer." That night, Sitting on Claire's porch, they discussed the next steps. Richard decided he wouldn't return to New York, but he also wouldn't completely abandon the fight. With the help of trusted lawyers, he would continue the legal battle from a distance. "You know," Richard said, looking at the stars, "a few months ago, the idea of losing my company would have sent me into a panic. Now, of course, I don't want it to happen, but if it does, I know I'll be okay." Claire snuggled closer to him. "That's because you found something more valuable than any company or fortune." "You?" he asked, smiling. She laughed softly. "Well, that too, but I meant a purpose. You found your true calling, Richard." The days that followed brought a series of challenges. The news from New York wasn't encouraging, with Richard's ex-partners gaining ground in his absence. But with each obstacle that arose, Richard was surprised by his own resilience and by the unwavering support of the community around him. One morning, while working in the therapeutic garden being created at the back of the clinic, Richard was surprised by a familiar voice. "I never thought I'd see the day when Richard Atwood would trade Italian suits for gardening overalls." Richard turned, astonished. There, impeccably dressed and looking out of place at the construction site, was Victoria, his ex-fiancée. "Victoria, what are you doing here?" She shrugged, an enigmatic smile on her lips. "I came to see for myself. The newspapers won't stop talking about the philanthropist magnate who gave up everything. I had to check if it was true." Richard stood up, wiping his dirty hands on his pants. "It is true, but I doubt you came all the way here just out of curiosity." Victoria sighed, her facade of indifference crumbling a bit. "You're right. I came. Because I'm worried about you, Richard. Your partners are about to take over the company. Everything you built will be lost," Richard completed. "Maybe. But look around you, Victoria. I'm building something new here, something that really matters." At that moment, Claire approached, bringing a tray of lemonade for the workers. She stopped when she saw Victoria, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Oh, sorry. I didn't know we had a visitor," Claire said, her voice polite but with a touch of coolness. Richard made the introductions, feeling the tension in the air. Victoria looked from Richard to Claire, a sudden understanding in her eyes. "Now I understand," she said softly. "It's not just the clinic, it's her. You really have changed, Richard." There was a moment of tense silence before Victoria continued. "I came here thinking I could convince you to come back, to fight for the company, but I see it would be pointless." Richard nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you for caring, Victoria. But my place is here now." Before leaving, Victoria stopped, looking one last time at the clinic under construction. "You know, a part of me always knew there was more to you than just ambition and money. I'm glad you found your way, Richard." After Victoria's departure, Richard and Claire remained silent for a moment, absorbing what had happened. "Are you okay?" Claire finally asked. Richard smiled, pulling her close. "Better than ever. You know why? Because now I'm absolutely certain that I made the right choice." That night, as the moon gently illuminated the clinic's construction site, Richard reflected on his journey. From ruthless magnate to passionate philanthropist, from a life of empty luxuries to an existence full of purpose and true love. The future was still uncertain. The battle for the company in New York was far from over, and the challenges to complete and maintain the clinic were many. But with Claire by his side and the support of the community, Richard knew he could face any obstacle. As he prepared for bed, Richard looked out the window, seeing the lights of the town in the distance. He smiled, thinking of how many lives would be touched and transformed by the clinic, and at that moment, he knew he wouldn't trade this life for any fortune in the world. The man who once measured success in figures now measured it in smiles, in lives saved, and in the unconditional love he had found in Claire's arms. And for the first time in his life, Richard Atwood slept with the certainty that he was exactly where he should be, doing exactly what he was born to do. Winter arrived in upstate New York, bringing with it cold mornings and crystal-clear blue skies. The community clinic, now nearly completed, stood majestically against the horizon, a testament to the power of unity and perseverance. Richard, his hair slightly grayer and with lines of expression that spoke of sleepless nights and days of hard work, walked down the main corridor of the clinic. The walls, still smelling of fresh paint, boasted colorful murals painted by local artists depicting scenes of rural life and messages of hope and healing. Amazing, isn't it? Claire's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She approached, intertwining her fingers with his. Sometimes I still can't believe we did it. Richard smiled, feeling a wave of pride and gratitude. We did it, Claire. All of us. The big day was due. Approaching. In a week, the clinic would officially open its doors to the community. The anticipation was palpable, not just among Richard and Claire, but throughout the region. However, not everything was rosy. The legal battle in New York continued, and the news wasn't encouraging. Richard's ex-partners were on the verge of gaining full control of the company, using his prolonged absence as justification. One afternoon, while Richard was supervising the arrival of the last medical equipment, his cell phone rang. It was his lawyer in New York. Richard, the voice on the other end sounded grave. I'm sorry, but we lost the last appeal. The judge ruled in favor of your ex-partners. They now have majority control of the company. Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that news. Years of work, of building, all lost. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the pain of the loss. But then he looked around. He saw the excited faces of the volunteers, the dedication of the doctors who had joined the project, the sparkle in Claire's eyes as she guided a team of nurses, and he realized that, in fact, he hadn't lost anything. He had gained something, much more valuable. Thank you for everything, counselor, Richard said to the lawyer. I know you did your best. After hanging up, Richard took a deep breath. Claire, noticing that something had happened, approached. Is everything okay? She asked, concern in her voice. Richard nodded, a serene smile on his face. Yes, it is. I just lost my company in New York, but you know what? I'm at peace with it. Claire hugged him tightly, understanding without needing words the magnitude of that moment. You didn't lose a company, Richard. You gained a purpose. The days leading up to the clinic's inauguration were a whirlwind of activities. Final adjustments, last training sessions for the staff, preparations for the opening ceremony. Richard and Claire worked tirelessly, driven by the expectation of finally seeing their dream realized. On the eve of the inauguration, while doing a final inspection of the clinic, Richard surprised Claire with an unexpected request. Marry me, he said, stopping in the middle of the corridor and holding her hands. Claire blinked, surprised. What? Richard smiled, his eyes shining with emotion. Marry me, Claire. Here, in this clinic we built together, surrounded by the people who helped us make this possible. Tears began to form in Claire's eyes. Richard, are you sure? I mean, with everything that's happening, I'm more sure of this than anything else in my life, he replied, his tone firm and full of conviction. You showed me what really matters. You helped me become the man I always wanted to be. I want to spend the rest of my life by your side, building more dreams like this one. Claire kissed him, a more eloquent response than any words could be. The day of the inauguration dawned sunny, as if the sky itself wanted to celebrate. The entire community seemed to have gathered in front of the clinic. Smiling faces, children running with colorful balloons, elderly people moved to see a decades-long dream finally coming true. Richard and Claire, hand in hand, climbed onto the small stage set up for the occasion. The buzz of the crowd diminished as Richard approached the microphone. A year ago, he began, his voice laden with emotion, I was a different man. A man who believed that success was measured in money and power. But then an accident brought me here, and here among you I found something much more valuable. He paused, looking at the attentive faces in front of him. I found purpose. I found community, and I found love. He smiled at Claire, who returned the smile, tears in her eyes. This clinic is not mine, Richard continued. It's not ours. It belongs to all of you. Every brick, every piece of equipment, every painting on the walls tells the story of a community that came together for a greater good. And for that, I will be eternally grateful. When the clinic doors were officially opened, the emotion was palpable. People hugged Richard and Claire, thanking them, crying, laughing. It was more than the inauguration of a building. It was the celebration of a collective dream realized. Later, when the excitement had died down a bit, Richard and Claire found a moment of quiet. Sitting on the steps at the entrance of the clinic, they watched the sunset paint the sky in golden and pink hues. "So," Claire said, leaning on Richard's shoulder, "what comes next?" Richard smiled, gently kissing the top of her head. "Now? Now we begin the next chapter. We have a wedding to plan, a clinic to run, and who knows, maybe more. Dreams to fulfill." As the first stars began to dot the sky, Richard reflected on his journey. From ruthless magnate to passionate philanthropist, from a life of empty luxuries to an existence full of meaning and true love. The road ahead would still have its challenges, he knew. Keeping the clinic running, expanding its services, perhaps even replicating the model in other needy communities. But with Claire by his side and the support of an entire community, Richard knew he could face anything. The man who once measured success in figures now measured it in transformed lives, in genuine smiles, and in the unconditional love he had found. And there, sitting on the steps of the clinic he had helped build, with the woman he loved by his side, Richard Atwood finally understood the true meaning of wealth. The future was bright, full of possibilities and promises. And for the first time in his life, Richard was truly eager to see what tomorrow would bring. The months following the clinic's inauguration were a whirlwind of activities and emotions for Richard and Claire. The clinic quickly became a focal point of the community, not only providing essential medical care, but also transforming into a center for health education and wellness. On a sunny spring morning, Richard was in his small office at the clinic, reviewing some reports when Claire entered, an enigmatic smile on her face. "We have a visitor," she announced. Before Richard could ask who it was, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. It was Mark, his former assistant from New York City. Richard," Mark greeted, looking a bit uncomfortable. Richard stood up, surprised, but genuinely happy to see his ex-employee. "Mark, what a pleasant surprise. What brings you here?" Mark hesitated for a moment before responding. "Actually, I came because I want to join you." Richard and Claire exchanged surprised looks. Mark continued, "After you left, things in New York changed. Your ex-partners, they've turned the company into something I don't recognize anymore. And seeing what you've built here, the impact you're having, well, it made me rethink a lot of things." Richard remained silent for a moment, absorbing Mark's words. Finally, he smiled and extended his hand. "Welcome to the team, Mark. We have a lot of work ahead of us." Mark's arrival brought new energy to the project. His experience in management and finance proved invaluable for the clinic's administration, allowing Richard and Claire to focus more on the medical and community aspects. Meanwhile, preparations for Richard and Claire's wedding were in full swing. They had decided on a simple but meaningful ceremony in the clinic's gardens. The entire community seemed to be involved in the preparations, turning the event into a true community celebration. One afternoon, a few weeks before the wedding, Richard received an unexpected call. It was Victoria. "Richard," her voice sounded hesitant over the phone. "I hope I'm not bothering you. I wanted to congratulate you for the wedding and for everything you've achieved there." Richard was momentarily speechless, surprised by the call and Victoria's sincere tone. "Thank you, Victoria," he finally replied. "That means a lot to me." There was a pause before Victoria continued. "You know, seeing you change so much, do something so meaningful, it made me rethink many things in my own life." They talked for a few minutes, Victoria sharing that she had started getting involved in volunteer work in New York, inspired by Richard's transformation. After hanging up, Richard was thoughtful. It was strange to see how his journey had affected not only his own life, but also the lives of people around him, even those from his distant past. The wedding day arrived, bringing with it an atmosphere of joy and celebration. The clinic's garden was beautifully decorated with wildflowers and delicate lights. Guests from all walks of life, from local residents to some old colleagues from New York who had made the trip, gathered to witness the union. When Claire appeared, walking down the improvised aisle between the chairs, Richard felt his heart race. She was radiant, wearing a simple but elegant dress, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. The vows were exchanged under an arch of flowers, with the upstate New York sunset as a backdrop. There wasn't a dry eye in the audience when Richard and Claire sealed their union with a kiss, the promise of a life together, dedicated to each other and to the community they had grown to love. The reception that followed was a joyful and relaxed party. Local music, food prepared by community volunteers, and an atmosphere of true celebration. At one point in the evening, Richard took to the small improvised stage to make a toast. "A year and a half ago," he began, his voice laden with emotion, "I was a lost man. I thought I had everything, but in reality I had nothing that really mattered." He paused, looking at Claire with adoration. "Then fate, or perhaps a very clever guardian angel, brought me here. And here, I found everything I never knew I needed." He raised his glass. "To my wife, Claire, who taught me the true meaning of wealth. To this incredible community, which welcomed us and showed us the power of unity. And to the future, which I now know will be bright, because we'll face it together." As the party continued into the night, Richard and Claire found a moment of quiet. Hand in hand, they walked to the entrance of the clinic, observing the lights of the town in the distance. "So, Mrs. Atwood," Richard joked, pulling Claire close, "what's the next chapter of our story?" Claire smiled, her eyes shining with love and determination. "Well, Mr. Thompson," she replied, using her surname that Richard had decided to adopt, symbolizing his new beginning, "I think we have a whole world to change, don't we?" Richard laughed, kissing her softly. "One step at a time, my love, one step at a time." As they returned to the party, hand in hand and hearts full, Richard reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him here. From soulless magnate to passionate philanthropist, from an empty life of luxury to an existence rich in purpose and love, the future was uncertain but promising. There were plans to expand the clinic's services, ideas for educational projects in the community, dreams of replicating the model in other needy areas. And with Claire by his side, Richard knew he could face any challenge that came. The man who once measured success in bank numbers now measured it in lives touched, in genuine smiles, and in the unconditional love he had found. And there, in the heart of upstate New York, surrounded by people who had become his true family, Richard Atwood finally understood the true meaning of a life well lived. The night went on, full of laughter, music, and promises of a bright future. And Richard, with Claire in his arms and his heart overflowing with gratitude, knew that this was just the beginning of their greatest adventure.